Jeff, it's really fun to talk to everyone here on the ground because there is a lot of momentum, particularly behind the ICT sector and in terms of entrepreneurs. His Majesty assuring me in that interview that you just heard that he's got the back of everyone who wants to do business in Jordan, and he's going to do whatever it takes to encourage private sector development. I want to introduce our guest, Majid Jafar. You're the CEO of Crescent Petroleum. I want to kind of take it back and go to the broader picture of what's happening in the region. We've heard some very, very disturbing news over the last couple of days, ISIS gains in Syria and in Iraq as well. You guys work on the ground in Iraq. Give us a sense of what the business community is feeling there.
I think that despite all the negative headlines, we need to sort of look beyond the headlines, and there are bits of good news. I think the subtext to the whole summit here would be seeds of growth and optimism despite the raging forest fire. And we actually have to pursue the economic agenda in parallel with trying to deal with some of these conflicts. Iraq and Egypt are very well represented here by President Sisi and a lot of the Iraqi government and senior officials. We as Crescent Petroleum and Danagas, our publicly listed affiliate, have invested about $2 billion in each of those two countries over the last 7 years. In Iraq, despite the conflict, the war, and the lack of consensus on policy, we've got the highest oil production ever in Iraq's history. And there is a lot of growth potential in many sectors of the economy. And in Egypt, I think we've really seen it turn around economically. And the IMF this year put out a much more positive forecast for the region's growth, particularly the oil importing countries that are benefiting from the lower oil prices.
And big questions here around renewable energy and the future of that, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in Jordan as well. But I want to ask you about oil prices. Who are the big winners and losers here?
I actually think, despite being in the oil business, that the somewhat lower oil prices, I mean, I don't think $60, $70 where we're at is a collapse by historical standards. It's actually been good for the region. For the oil importers, obviously, it's a lot of savings and money they can better put now to investment, as well as giving them an opportunity to tackle the subsidies, because the difference between the oil price and the subsidized price is less, so the pain on the consumer would be less. But it's also, I think, been good for producers. It's refocused attention on diversification, economic diversification, better efficiency to use less of your own production. We've been getting high on our own supply in many Gulf countries, as you know, and that will actually be better for the long term.
I'm talking about getting high on your own supply, specifically Saudi Arabia, for example. What's your outlook for that country, given the fact that we're going to be seeing Iran crude come back onto the market?
So I think the region as a whole is going to continue to be very important going forward. Iran crude coming back on will not be a huge game changer. I mean, maybe 1 million barrels over a few years, compared to the several million barrels North America has been adding every year for the last few years. The actual bigger game changers in a global perspective are what happens to North American supply in the new oil price environment, and above all, what happens to Chinese demand. Because Chinese growth and Chinese demand and other developing powerhouses like India are going to be the biggest drivers of what happens to oil price. Within the region, there's been a big shift from income, from producers to consumers potentially, but there's a lot of capital in the region. I mean, over the last few years of $100 oil, we have $4 trillion maybe in government coffers, in sovereign wealth funds and so on, particularly in the Gulf states, and a lot of capital in the private sector. The key now, and what's a big part of the agenda here, how can we unlock some of that capital for an inward investment agenda, in particular the area of infrastructure, where we need $100 billion of infrastructure investment every year just to keep up. We're way behind China in terms of percentage of infrastructure spending, and that has become a key focus for this summit, because without that investment and the growth from it, we're never going to create enough jobs for the youth, which is the #1 risk as identified by the World Economic Forum for our region, youth unemployment.
Majid Jafar, CEO of Crescent Petroleum, thanks so much for joining us. Guys, back to you.
All right, excellent work out there again. Thank you very much indeed for that. Hadley.